So I've got an inflammation of the stomach due to alcohol. Gastritis alcoholic gives me a 535.3. All right, underneath that I see a box that tells me that for every 535 code, I've got to either have a 0 or a 1, meaning with or without hemorrhage. There's no mention of hemorrhage, so what's my fifth digit? 0. So let's look up 535.30. And 535.30 tells us alcoholic gastritis without mention of hemorrhage. All right, well, that was the gastritis, but did that code do anything for the chronic alcoholism? No. So now I've got to code the alcoholism, don't I? So I go right back to the alphabetic. I look up alcoholism.
So, Ms. Gates, even when you do know what you're doing, you never going to leave the alphabet and the tablet. You know, the alphabet always follow the steps regardless of how long you've been doing it, right?
Exactly. You'll never get away from that, ever. So I go to alcoholism, chronic, 303.9. I do have a C also code that tells me that if 303.9 is not adequate enough, then I need to see also alcoholism. But just for curiosity, if I go to alcoholism and I go to chronic, what am I going to get? Same code, right? So now let's go to 303.9 and check it in the tabular. And 303.9 is other and unspecified alcohol dependence. Included in that is chronic alcoholism. Has to have a fifth digit. Is ours unspecified, continuous, episodic, or in remission? It's unspecified, isn't it? So there's your 303.90. Okay, in both of those codes, both number 1 and number 2, you ended up with 2 codes, didn't you? A code for each of those things individually. So let's look at that versus number 3. You have the answer key, so you already know that you're only going to have 1 code for that. But wait a minute. When you look at the diagnosis, don't you have diverticulitis and don't you have intestinal hemorrhage?
Yes.
Well, aren't you thinking you're going to have 2 codes for that?
Yes.
Well, let's see why you don't. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. All right, so we look up diverticulitis. Diverticula, diverticulosis, diverticulum, and then followed by diverticulitis. It is of the colon. So now we have to make a decision whether or not there was hemorrhage or not. Was there any hemorrhage? Yes. And that gives us a code of 562.13. All right, we look up 562.13 to check and make sure it's right. And 562.13 is diverticulitis of colon with hemorrhage. Huh. Well, that looks like what our diagnosis is, doesn't it? But I'm not sure. So I'm kind of one of those obsessive-compulsive people. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to look up intestinal hemorrhage and see what happens. Because I'm not sure if I did this right, okay? So I go right back to the alphabetic. And I look up hemorrhage. And I find intestinal hemorrhage. And what code do I get? All right, so I look up 578.9. look at under the excludes note. It excludes that with mention of diverticulitis. You with me? Fine. See it?
578.
Right up under the 578 part, because you have to go back and look up the excludes notes for the category code too. So, gosh, that's telling me that if this is a patient that had diverticulitis, then this is not the right gastrointestinal hemorrhage code, and doesn't it take me right back where I was? So I've done it the hard way. I've looked it up both ways, but I ended up with the same code, didn't I? So does that pretty much tell me that I'm right? Okay, so my question still is, why in number 3 do you have only one code, but in number 1 and number 2 you had 2 codes, and in all 3 of those examples you basically had 2 things going on? Because the book said so. And that's the only answer you need. If you'll follow the book, if you'll follow the instructions of the book. Now let's think about it a little bit. When the book was written by the physicians, they determined what they thought was appropriate to code together and what was appropriate to code separately. In diverticulitis, you do often have hemorrhage. Not always, but you do often. And so that's why one code was pretty much all that was needed. If you look at the acute cystitis due to E. coli, well, can't you have cystitis from a lot of different organisms? So we don't really want one code for just E. coli cystitis, do we? Because that would, we'd have to have so many. And then alcoholic gastritis due to chronic alcoholism, well, the one reason for that is alcoholism is coded as a mental disorder. That 300 code falls in the mental, whereas alcoholic gastritis is not by way of the 500 code. So there are lots of reasons, but the bottom line is let the book direct you and you'll be fine. All right, that brings us to a stopping point. With the avoiding indiscriminate multiple coding at the top of page 46. Don't code things like signs or symptoms that are explained by way of a diagnosis. It's just indiscriminate multiple coding. It will be wrong in the classroom. It would be wrong in real life. It is, however, better to overcode than undercode. But in the classroom setting, we've got to teach you that even though it might fly in the real world, it is an inappropriate use of a code. And you don't want to use one of your holding places for your codes on the billing form. There's a limited number. And you don't want to use one of those when you should have used something else. So that's what indiscriminate multiple coding is all about.
Kind of like they're just thinking.
Or maybe it's even documented, but it's not relevant to the current episode of care, or it's a symptom that's explained by way of a diagnosis. Back to if you've got an MI and chest pain, do you code the chest pain? No, because the diagnosis explains it. Could you have a code for chest pain, or is there a code for chest pain? Sure, you could put both, but wouldn't it be a waste of a code? Wouldn't it be a waste of your time? Wouldn't it be extraneous information sitting there in your database, taking up space that's costing you? That's something I always want you to keep in mind, is when you're putting codes into the computer, are they taking up space? Is space valuable, even computer space? Oh, yeah. So you never want to put in anything that doesn't have a reason for being there. And so to code chest pain when you've got an MI, or to code abdominal pain when you've got appendicitis. Aren't you going to have abdominal pain when you have appendicitis? Yeah, it's an extraneous extra code. All right, we're going to stop there, and we're going to pick up next week with the code unconfirmed diagnoses as if established on the bottom of page 46. Any questions about anything tonight?